Hi everyone. As people trickle in, I just want to say thanks very much for joining us. My name is Sam Alvis. I'm Head of Economy at Green Alliance, and today we will be talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, and in particular, what that might mean for the UK. You could say it's quite a timely Green Alliance event. The Inflation Reduction Act was passed only in August, but the waves it has set in motion have definitely reached the shores of both the UK and Europe. As background, Biden's programme is easily the largest climate bill in US history. It is estimated that it could cost in the region of $400 billion, but this is uncapped climate spending. It could be $1 trillion, we just don't know yet. But I think more interesting for us is how the White House has pitched its plan, not just as solving environmental issues, but a new muscular form of green industrial strategy intended to improve the US economy, yes, and help it decarbonise, but also tackle societal challenges like the provision of childcare, unionisation of the workforce, and some other interesting things that we might get into. Europe, worried about its own companies, has responded with its own plan. So yes, they're concerned about what it might mean for, say, Volkswagen and its production of electric vehicles, but they too are also promising to spend big, adjust regulations and put climate at the centre of their own new green industrial strategy. But for those of you who haven't noticed, the UK is no longer part of the EU. And traditionally, while we've been the bridge across the Atlantic, we now find ourselves floating on our own boat somewhere in the middle, buffeted by waves from both sides. So the UK, we're going to have to develop our own response or see our self-proclaimed green clown slip. And it's well timed. There's a budget next week. There is a pressing need to respond to Chris Skidmore's independent review of net zero, update the green finance strategy, and respond to the judicial review of the net zero strategy. So what then does Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, and Prime Minister Rishi Sunak need to do? To help, Green Alliance today has published a series of essays, which my colleague will drop into the chat. These essays cover both individual economic sectors, whether that's renewables or the electric vehicle industry, or economy-wide perspectives on trade, on levelling up and industrial policy. And I'm really lucky today to be joined by 3 of those excellent essay authors to talk more in depth about the Inflation Reduction Act and what that might mean for their area of expertise. So we have Anna Musat, Executive Director of Policy at Renewable UK, Luke Murphy, Associate Director at the Institute for Public Policy Research, and GA's own Head of Climate, Helena Bennett. So how this is going to work, I will go to each of them in turn to ask a couple of questions on the Inflation Reduction Act and what that might mean for the UK. I might then use my chair's prerogative to ask a follow-up, but please bung all of the questions that are top of your mind or you think should be top of government's mind, more importantly, into the Q&A, and then I will pick those up as we go. If you're lucky, I might even get to my own essay on industrial policy and its resurgence. It's very exciting. It's the only essay that has a colour-coded table in it, so more on that later. But for now, I'm going to pass over to Green Alliance Head of Climate, Helena Bennett, to talk about her essay. Helena.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for the intro. Hi, everybody. I'm Helena. I'm Head of Climate Policy at Green Alliance. One of the areas of work that we do most prominently here is on transport decarbonisation. In the UK, it's the biggest emitting sector, and it's one of the biggest emitting sectors globally as well. And cars make up a huge proportion of those emissions. Petrol and diesel vehicles are responsible for really bad air pollution in urban areas, and obviously are also contributing quite significantly to carbon emissions. So it's absolutely no surprise to any of us that the US has focused quite heavily on electric vehicles, batteries, and critical minerals as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. They've become a bit of a spotlight tech over the last few years and will continue to be one of the biggest areas of green innovation and technology going forward as we transition away from petrol and diesel vehicles and towards electric vehicles. So you might have heard of some of the stuff that's happened in the Inflation Reduction Act regarding EVs. A couple of key points just in terms of the contents of the bill. So there's $7,500 available to consumers on any vehicles meeting a couple of requirements. So one being that critical minerals for batteries are processed in a country with which the US has a free trade agreement, or recycled in the northern parts of America. And actually that threshold increases from this year up until I think it's 2026. So at the moment, it's a 40% threshold, and it goes up to 80% in 2026 onwards. And then there's another part of the subsidy, which is for battery components being manufactured and assembled in North America as well. So again, that works on a threshold basis. So 50% in 2023 and moving up to 100% later. And then there are also additional tax credits available to manufacturers satisfying other criteria along the value chain of critical minerals, batteries, and electric vehicles. So there's lots going on. From a UK point of view, we've had really good ambition from government on electric vehicles through the proposal of a zero emission vehicles mandate, although we're yet to see legislation for that, and also some good rollout of charging infrastructure. The big problem that we're facing at the moment is our ability to produce and manufacture batteries here in the UK. Places where batteries for EVs are produced en masse are called gigafactories. You've probably heard that term thrown around, and you've probably heard about Britishvolt, one of the only proposed gigafactories in the UK at the moment, and it's gone through a bit of a hard time recently. The context of what's happened in the UK and now what's happening in the US is that there's very little reason for investors to come to the UK and invest in gigafactories and battery production, and therefore electric vehicle production here. We've seen recently that Ford has announced job cuts in both the UK and Europe and is committing to a new nearly $4 billion gigafactory in Michigan in the US. And they've said very clearly that tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act are one of the reasons for that. And Arrival have also stated that because of the pull of the Inflation Reduction Act, they're cutting some UK jobs. We did a bit of analysis showing that to replicate the subsidies that the Inflation Reduction Act has for electric vehicles and batteries in the UK would cost an unbelievable 65 billion between now and 2030. We just don't have the funds for that at the moment in the UK. And in the EU, similarly, they are responding to the Inflation Reduction Act in a variety of ways. So individual member states are already offering specific funding for gigafactories and battery production. France has committed 12 billion since 2020. Germany is planning spending of nearly 6 billion euros this year as well for electric vehicles and battery manufacturing. And the EU has also come up with a new package of legislation, including a Critical Raw Materials Act and a Net Zero Industry Act. And they're also loosening state aid rules for funding. So there's stuff going on, as Sam said, across the Channel and across the Atlantic, and it's putting the UK in a really tricky position for batteries and gigafactories in particular. So if we can't match funding from a financial point of view, there are other things that we can be thinking about and that government can intervene on. And the very first thing that we think is absolutely critical, and we've heard from a lot of other organizations and interested stakeholders in this space as well, is having a long-term strategy and vision for batteries and electric vehicles in the UK. We currently don't have a battery strategy. We've heard that there is development of one, but it's yet to be produced. And investor confidence will be driven by having some kind of vision and plan. It'll be core for industry, core for investors, and also core for consumers to know that this is the direction that we are going in when it comes to driving and electric vehicles. A second thing that we think government could do, which would be incredibly helpful, is creating a register of existing car manufacturers in the UK that can include things like the types of batteries that they will require, the types of minerals that will be required for those batteries, the scalability that they can expect to see with electric vehicles over the coming years. And on the other side of the register, information about proposed gigafactories, including the types of batteries they can produce, the types of minerals they will be using, and their possible scalability and requirements. And doing a bit of a matchmaking process, because at the moment the landscape is quite opaque. This register could also include things like possible sites that investors could look at for developing gigafactories, including things like access to the grid and transportation between where the gigafactories are and where the car factories are. there's a big role for government to play here in brokering is probably too strong a word, but signposting agreements between these manufacturers of cars and manufacturers of batteries. Another couple of things. This is a recommendation that the Green Finance Institute came up with that we completely support, and I know someone from GFI is on the call, hello, is around a battery investment facility, which would bridge public-private investment pipeline. So at the moment, we're seeing some funding from government going into the gigafactory landscape. The problem is then attracting larger scale investment from the private sector. So doing a kind of blended finance approach that the government could manage, and we've seen in other areas of green tech and innovation work quite well, we think would be a really strong way of attracting investors and making sure that the level of battery production we require in the UK to keep our auto manufacturing sector afloat would be really, really positive. There are options for kind of additional subsidy for using green energy directly. For example, if you place a site near the coast and can use direct offshore wind, and things like speeding up the planning process as well, and creating a bit of a map, as we said with the register, for where gigafactories could go. So that's just a bit of an idea of what's available to the government to start thinking about. But I think the key thing to reiterate is this long-term vision of what we want to see from gigafactories, batteries, electric vehicles, critical materials. These things all tie in really nicely together. We've got a zero emission vehicles mandate, hopefully coming 1st of January next year. So this all ties in really well together, and we really hope we can see something like this from the government very soon.
Well, thanks, Helena. And just, I guess, to play, not devil's advocate, but just, you talk about the need for a long-term plan. How much of this is an Inflation Reduction Act related problem versus underlying issues in the automotive sector anyway? So you saw, for example, Mini moved their manufacturing out, EV manufacturing out of Oxford a while ago. The British Volt collapse was potentially out with the Inflation Reduction Act. Where do you think, is it something that shone a spotlight on an existing problem, or is it actually an additional level of problem?
Yeah, I think it's probably the former. It's just shone a light on an existing problem. The Mini relocation to China is partly because of their availability of critical minerals, something that, again, the UK needs a bit of a strategy on. We've got a critical mineral strategy, but it doesn't say anything about, how to properly source materials that we need for batteries. So that kind of ties into this long-term vision that I'm talking about as well. But I think if you've already got an existing problem of not getting investors in the UK to scale up the development of gigafactories, having something like the Inflation Reduction Act coming in is even more of a draw away from the UK. So it is a big problem in itself, but I don't think it's necessarily the cause of the issue that we're seeing here. It's just inflated what we were already seeing.
Brilliant, thanks. Right, so after an overview of a potential future area that the UK was hoping to excel at, let's move on to an area which it has already been excelling at, the renewables industry. So Anna, Inflation Reduction Act, are your members worried, excited? How are they thinking about it?
Yeah, thanks, Sam, and thanks for the invite. I've talked quite a lot about this topic recently, as you can imagine. I think there's mixed feelings, basically. If you look at it from the perspective of we need to reduce our emissions across the globe, it's definitely good news. We like to see the US playing its part and investing a lot more in the industry. If you're looking at it from the point of view of investment in the UK and maximizing the benefits of renewables, it's not such great news, because indeed it will pull a lot of investment away from here to the US. I think for us, there's obviously quite a lot of interesting things in the Inflation Reduction Act. There's tax breaks, incentives for clean energy investment across technologies. It's really interesting that also they offer specific incentives for manufacturing capabilities in the US. So again, there's a risk there of moving some supply chains, which actually the UK was already quite weak on already. There's a risk of rearranging supply chains even further and moving these to the US. So I think a lot of the concern comes from there. From my perspective, if we look at the US and the UK, you can almost see two very different responses to the energy crisis and to inflation. So on the US side, you almost have this build back better approach that a lot of us have been talking about since COVID times. really investing quite a lot in the technologies of the future, investing to increase productivity, and looking at establishing supply chain skills and all of that. And I think, crucially, if we look at what is actually in the IRA from a renewables perspective, we have these tax breaks, we have these incentives at the federal level. They're quite easy to navigate and understand for investors. So the pool that the market is exercising is actually quite significant, and we already see that from the UK perspective. If the UK and its response to the energy crisis and inflation, it's kind of been going in the opposite direction. It really didn't help that we had 3 successive governments over the course of this period. So inherently, that creates quite a lot of political instability and a bit of a disruption in terms of policy and regulation. But I think in addition to that, we've had a few specific interventions which didn't help. One is that we've had the discussions on price cap and windfall taxes on electricity generators. And the aim is absolutely admirable. Obviously, you need to tackle supernormal profits instead of just letting consumers pay for everything. But actually, a lot of those profits aren't necessarily realized, at least for renewable generators. If you look at their end of year results, they're not amazing. The margins aren't really that sustainable anyway. And also the way that the windfall taxes are designed, they actually lead to investment from renewables towards oil and gas, with greater investment allowances for the latter. We've also seen a bit of a race to the bottom on prices when it comes to renewables. And I think in the past few decades, we've seen prices going down quite significantly. But I think there always comes a point where you think, well, how much can we keep reducing prices whilst ensuring that the industry remains sustainable? And I think now is the point where we need to ask ourselves that, really, because the prices for renewables are already so low, much lower than any of the alternatives, really. And we need to make sure that the margins are sustainable. There's some incentive for developers to continue operating here, to invest in supply chains. And I think, with parameters that we're seeing from government for future CFD rounds, it's just not looking that promising. So I think we really need to think about how we move away from the race to the bottom of prices and maximize out the benefits of renewables. And I think one interesting example for me to mention in relation to the UK-US comparison is hydrogen, because the UK has been talking about green hydrogen business models for a few years now, and we've all responded to consultations. We've been in many meetings about this, and we still don't have the finalized business models. Now, the US has just gone and given hydrogen investors some tax breaks, which makes it really easy for them, and because they're at the federal level, they can just go for them no matter what jurisdiction they want to invest in. We're already seeing quite a lot of green hydrogen investors pulling away from the UK and going to the US market and quoting IRA as the primary reason for that. So we're already seeing the impact of it. We just need to be really mindful not to accentuate that trend. That all sounds a bit bleak, but there's actually quite a lot of things that we could do. And again, as you mentioned, renewables is the UK success story. We're a mature market. There's already quite a lot of investors in this space. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we could do to ensure that we retain our competitive advantage and the fact that we're our first movers in this space. So I think in the short term, say we've got a budget next week. I think that's a really good opportunity to signal to investors that the government is really serious about retaining investment in renewables here. And if you think about the signals that we've been sending to investors, they haven't been that great over the past few months. But now is an opportunity to say, no, we're committed to this. We need to make it happen. What we'd like to see from the budget is a reform of the capital allowances regime, because we completely understand that we can't offer tax breaks on par with the IRA. We're a smaller economy, but it's not necessarily about that. It's about signaling to investors that it's still profitable to invest in the UK. And a reform of capital allowances could do just that. As wind farms have become more efficient and we've reached economies of scale, they now have a useful life asset of 25 years plus, which means that the capital allowances they're now eligible for are just 6%, or before it was 18. So we'd really like to see that removal of useful asset life in the capital allowances regime reform. The other thing that we really need to look at, and Helena's already touched on this, is sorting out some of those non-financial barriers that we're facing and the industry's been talking about for a while. So that's mainly on planning and on grid. And I think if we sort those out, we could really have a major competitive advantage relative to the US. If we look at investment in renewables, then we've already seen onshore wind investors and solar investors in the US really willing to put their capital there, but actually having the projects denied because of planning regulations. You know, if we sort this out in the UK, it could actually give us a really important advantage. And if you think about the grid stuff, you know, we need to build more transmission. We already know this. We need to speed up the rate at which we connect projects to the grid. We're now facing delays of 10 years plus. Again, it could be a really significant advantage. And to be fair, government's already started the work on reforming the planning system, on ensuring that we can invest in grid ahead of time. And National Grid's also announced some reforms recently to reform the connections process. So I think just moving much faster on that would really help us compared to the US. They're going to be facing the same problems. And again, if you just think about the grid challenge, the sheer scale of the US means that the challenge is going to be way more significant. A lot of the solar and wind generation is likely to be in those center states, and then they're going to need to be to build a lot of transmission to move it to coastal areas where the big centers of demand are. So again, that's going to be a lot of planning issues to navigate, a lot of community engagement, and we can really take the lead on this and remove some of these barriers. Finally, I mean, I think everyone's going to be talking about this, but you know, having a really joined up plan for attracting investment into the UK is going to be really important in the long term. So whether we call it an industrial strategy or plan for growth, it doesn't really matter what we call it, but it's about ensuring that we have the capability to be able to scale up. Because we can talk about how we deliver the cheapest form of electricity, you know, we can talk about how we build the infrastructure, but ultimately the concern right now is that we don't have the supply chains to scale up sufficiently, and we don't really have the skills in the economy to be able to meet those targets that the government has set. So a plan that looks not at just how we bring the cheapest electricity online, but also how we get supply chains in place and how we get the skills and how we get those transferables that are already in the economy into the renewable sector is going to be really important. So you know, quite a lot of reasons to remain optimistic, but yeah, I think really looking to the budget next week for some short-term signals, some quicker movement on planning and grid, and yeah, in the long term, hopefully we'll get an industrial strategy as well.
Thanks, Anna. That's brilliant. I think your sound was a little bit Dalek-y, so I don't know if you want to have a play with any settings. It might be your internet connection. That's all right. No, so you touched on lots that I think is going to come up on the chat, particularly let's get definitely stuck into supply chains and the grid. I just wanted to ask one follow-up on the capital allowances. So I think you've definitely got the support of Green Alliance there, in that we wrote back in September under then Premier Liz Truss that we need to start thinking about capital allowances that are much more outcome-based rather than just passive. And you saw what happened with the energy profits levy, you know, and gas getting quite a substantial one, but no equivalent under the energy generators levy. Now, what people in Treasury and people in Number 10 have said to us is, well, actually, the energy generators already have CFDs. That's their form of subsidy. By subsidising upstream, what you're effectively doing is you're just paying to meet a lower CFD strike price down the line. I sort of understand that, but is it the case? Do you think it's the case now that actually the upstream subsidies are whether a project goes ahead or not, regardless of whether it's the strike price? Is it what's needed to get these projects actually off the ground so we can decarbonise, or is it about meeting a certain price at the end of it?
Yeah, I think it's totally about ensuring the projects can go ahead. And you know, we've seen some articles from big developers in the UK saying that actually a lot of projects are slightly at risk. We're seeing delays to final investment decisions because it just costs more to build that up now. If we think about when those contracts have been signed and where we are now in terms of prices of raw materials, prices of labour, and inflation, it's quite a challenging proposition. And actually, what concerns me is that if we look at the next allocation round parameters that have been published already, the prices are just as low as they've been with in the previous round. And I think that's just not sustainable anymore. And you know, I think if the CFD isn't working properly, then we need to make sure we've got another route to market for these projects, because they're really, really important. And I think because of those levies that you've mentioned, it's now less likely that projects go to market on a purely merchant basis. So again, the CFD pathway is going to be even more crowded Are we going to see a bigger budget for the CFDs? I'm not sure. There's also been changes to pot structures, which creates more competition between feasible projects and good technologies. So I think we're slightly at risk of, trying to put too much onus on the CFD when actually there's other market conditions that can prevent it from delivering what it needs to do.
Yeah, I think that's right, and an incredibly fine line for government to strike it at a time when bills are higher. Who's wanting to come across as doing everything they can to lower bills, but obviously the more renewables, eventually the lower the bills, but difficult to do that in the short term. Thanks, Anna. Right, over to Luke. So Luke's essay is all about the impacts on sort of regional growth, regional outcomes, and levelling it up. He's also been doing an awful lot of work behind the scenes with some of the organisations involved in the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. So I think a lot to cover. So Luke, I'll pass you an open floor. What have you taken from the Inflation Reduction Act?
Thanks, Sam, and thanks to Green Alliance for taking my essay and also hosting the event. I think the first thing I'd say is actually that, the approach, as you kind of outlined at the beginning, Sam, of the Inflation Reduction Act take shouldn't be a huge surprise. I think that, it's something that Biden, while he didn't campaign on it necessarily, has kind of alluded to since he was inaugurated. I think Biden, as I allude to in my piece, that Biden and Boris Johnson signed a statement a couple of years ago highlighting the fact that they believed, as quote, the current economic models were kind of leaving many communities behind and driving the climate crisis, and kind of committed to an economic reform agenda which would tackle both the climate crisis and also kind of level up communities. And I think, the Inflation Reduction Act is the fruition of that in the United States. And I think the big problem for the UK, as well as everything that Helena and Anna have set out, is that we are not following the same approach. And I think there are probably 5 key aspects of the Act that I think are worth drawing out, or certainly drawing lessons from. And I think it's important to say it's not just the Inflation Reduction Act. It also sits alongside the Chips and Science Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which were both passed on bipartisan grounds, whereas the Inflation Reduction Act passed without any Republican votes, which kind of demonstrate the big shift in policy that's kind of going on in the United States. First element, as you've kind of highlighted, is just the sheer scale of the investment. The likely investment will be even higher than official estimates. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that the total level of investment would be $400 billion, but actually it is now suggested, because of many of the tax credits are uncapped, that this could actually be up to 800 billion, if not a trillion, and in total kind of tripling the average annual spending on climate and energy this decade for the US relative to the 2010s. From our perspective at IPPR, and I agree with what everyone has said, that the UK cannot compete in terms of the sheer scale of investment, but as a proportion of GDP, we certainly could match the level of commitment in the US, and we are falling considerably short of what they will now be spending, what the EU are spending overall, and IPPR have previously identified a £30 billion public investment gap. So it's true that we have a wider toolkit because of political reasons. The US doesn't have the ability to apply as many regulations, phase out dates for like fossil fuel vehicles, etc. So we do have a wider kind of industrial strategy toolkit, but we can and should also be increasing public investment. I think secondly is just the return of, I think the EFT called it the most significant attempt to revive industrial policy in the Western capitalist world since the aftermath of the Second World War. So quite a grand statement about the bill, but it is quite startling the way in which the bill is designed is really clearly designed to kind of not just grow the economy overall, but actually to focus in particular on particular places and particular communities, really aligning the kind of climate action to levelling up. So as well as the things that others have alluded to around local content requirements, the tax credits in the bill are stacked. So investors will get more greater incentives if, for example, they produce or invest in particular energy communities or low-income communities as part of the bill as well. So they get bigger incentives if they do that. There's also specific funds dedicated to low-income communities, energy communities, and those that are going to be most effective in the short term and least able to adapt. And there's been lots of analysis that shows that fossil fuel hubs in the US are going to be the very areas with the greatest potential for renewable energy production. So someone talks in the chat about, do we need a deindustrialization strategy for those areas? Actually, I think it's what we've called, well, what many have called, a fair transition or just transition strategy, providing investment and support to the communities to shift across to the clean economy. I think the other interesting implication of that will be the political implications, because many of those areas are more likely to be represented by Republicans, and there's been reports none of whom voted for the bill, but there's been reports of them kind of touring trade shows in Europe, trying to get more investment for their state. So could have a really interesting impact on the politics as well as kind of place-based impact. I think the other thing to say, thirdly, is around the jobs, and it's not just the sheer number of jobs, but the high quality jobs that the Act will deliver. So, the estimates suggest 9 million jobs over the next decade, an average of 1 million jobs a year, which would represent kind of 5% of the civilian workforce in the US by the end of that period. But the legislation goes further in mandating kind of high quality jobs. It mandates high labour standards. It requires of a lot of the investors and organisations taking advantage of the incentives that they must be paid a fair wage. Requiring, for example, kind of what it's called prevailing wages in private development projects, for example, such as power generation, as well as kind of the use of union and registered apprenticeship schemes. And that's something that we've called for, similar here. It's not just a focus on the quality of jobs, but on job standards and jobs wages. And on the potential for unionising those jobs as well. Fourthly, and as many people have commented on, and you alluded to at the beginning, Sam, is the kind of what are called the corporate guardrails to socialise the risks and rewards of the investment that the federal government is implementing. What people have said they're trying to do is kind of shape and bend corporate behaviour. As well as the job standards and wage requirements contained within IRA, the government has also issued guidance for the CHIPS Act, which include financial conditions around preventing buybacks, share buybacks, and preventing excess profits, as well as kind of requiring firms to guarantee high quality and affordable childcare for their workers. So this is as much about, economic goals, climate goals, but also wider social goals as well. And then lastly, I think, and as others have alluded to, it really does provide, and this is the kind of the kicker, I think, for a lot of the communities as well that are going to benefit from this, is the sheer level of certainty and policy stability. If you actually, many of the tax credits, it's part of it sets out a 10-year framework, which signals a lot of policy stability. But actually, in the detail, it shows that many of the tax credits could actually last into the 2040s. So that's 2 decades worth of certainty, not just for the investors, but the communities that are going to potentially benefit from it. And in all of those areas where it's the job standards, the guardrails around public investment and the conditionality, the long-term certainty, the place-based industrial strategy approach, and the significant uplift in investment, it's a lot of those elements are missing from the UK's approach, with all the potential kind of impacts that others have alluded to. And I think that where I finish is just, lots of organisations, IPPR, Onward, recent analysis by ECIU have all shown, that we have a similar landscape to the US, in the sense of many of the biggest benefits and rewards from the transition can be accrued in areas outside of London, in the North East, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Southwest. We've identified prime capabilities, what we've called prime capabilities of particularly areas in the North, of where they could benefit from the transition. But at the moment, the policy that framework investment on offer isn't set up to deliver the same benefits as it is in the US in the Inflation Reduction Act. So yeah, I think those are the kind of key things, and I'll stop there.
Brilliant, thanks, Luke. I think Harold Wilson might have something to say about that FT headline and the greatest in terms of industrial strategy, but a really interesting point there, actually, that I think has been undercovered in all the talk about subsidies, that actually nationally the US didn't have a lot, many other places to turn in what they could do to stimulate decarbonisation, although places like obviously California and some of the democratic states have still got some regulatory tools in their arsenal. I was wondering just to sort of pick up on your point about the overlap between place-based investments, decarbonisation, and actual political sustainability. So The Guardian had a great graphic in the US a couple of days ago that actually sort of 2/3 of this spending is going to Republican-held states, and you talked about the governors going out and touting that. How much of that is, do you think, deliberate in that that's the way of maintaining sort of a political strategy over the long term, is actually to reward your opponents so they don't fight it? Or is this just, does that just happen to be the best places to put some of the onshore wind installations and the solar arrays? And does that relate to what Boris Johnson was trying to do in 2019 when he was talking about levelling up and green opportunities? Was it that where these places were, or was he trying to hold on to those seats that he won in 2019, do you think?
I think, so I think I don't know whether the Guardian stuff draws on the Brookings analysis, but the Brookings Institute did analysis of it, I think a couple of years ago, which does show that actually the greatest capacity and potential for kind of the clean energy transition in terms of renewables and power generation and others do lie in a lot of the fossil fuel hubs in the United States. So I think it's kind of both. I don't think it's a deliberate attempt to kind of win over, I don't know what you were suggesting in this, but win over kind of Republican politicians or Republicans per se. But I think it is a recognition, as we've long argued, as many in the trade union movement have argued, and many others, is that in order to ensure that the transition is sustainable, you do need to be able to maintain popular and public support. We can't repeat the mistakes of the past, where when people look for unjust transitions around the world, unfortunately they do tend to look at the UK during the 1980s. We need to learn the lessons from that. I think IRA does seek to do that, and does seek to kind of bend the benefits as much as possible to those areas that are going to lose out the most. So I'm sure there is an element of additional an additional support to those areas, but it is also a happy coincidence, as it is in the UK, I think, that many of the areas that are set to lose out also have some of the potential kind of capacity, capabilities, physical infrastructure, as well as human skills and human capital as well, to take advantage of the transition. So I'd say it's a kind of mixture of both.
That's really helpful, thanks. So if I just get the other panelists to bring their cameras on, and we'll go to a wider discussion. The Q&A is getting pretty packed. And I think the place I want to start is a question from Jonathan Fisher, and it's certainly something we're thinking about Green Alliance. I know IPPR are, but I'll come to Anna, then Helena first. Is what are the UK's key competitive and comparative advantages? The US has obviously tried to do everything. Should we try and do that, or do you think there are particular areas we need to focus either our fiscal or regulatory firepower? Anna.
Thanks, Sam. Can I just check if you can hear me better?
You sound much more human. It's excellent.
Okay.
Thank you.
Perfect. I mean, my answer is not going to surprise you from a renewable UK perspective, but I generally do think that renewables are an area where we have a competitive advantage. A few reasons for that. First of all, we've started the work early. We've got the business models for bringing renewables online, and there's quite a maturity to the UK market that the US market is lacking, perhaps. So I'd say that's one of the areas where we've got a significant advantage, especially if we look at offshore wind. But actually now the next frontier is floating offshore wind. We need to be able to develop that as well in the UK, but we need some key investments in infrastructure like ports, for example, to make it happen, which isn't really materializing now. And if we look at the US, they're investing a lot of federal level funding in that. They've got state level funding in places like New Jersey, again, specifically targeted at developing this infrastructure. So I think that's definitely something that we need to take into account, and we need to make sure we retain our competitive advantage. I think green hydrogen is another good example. As I've mentioned in my presentation, we started the work on that quite a lot. We've got a net zero hydrogen fund. We've got a net zero hydrogen standard. We've got these business models on the go, but we just need to make them happen much quicker. And, you know, I would say in terms of areas that aren't necessarily something we have a big competitive advantage in, but we really need to look at, I would say it's about manufacturing. And I find it quite frustrating that often you have politicians saying, well, why do we need to manufacture here where we could import from China and it's going to be cheaper? Well, actually, China is dominating renewable supply chains. I think by like 70% of components are actually manufactured in China. So I think it's an opportunity for us to not rely on other countries, to make sure that we can manufacture here, because there's a lot of jobs that come with that. There's a lot of investment in skills, and again, opportunities that are spread out across the country. And, you know, as we've seen with over-reliance on Russia, with gas, you know, we don't want to just be relying on one country, given the geopolitical situations, to get our supply chains from there. So I would say manufacturing is definitely one where we need to invest, irrespective of how much of a competitive advantage we have.
Helena.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I mean, in auto manufacturing, we've got a really, really rich history of designing, building, selling vehicles here in the UK. We've got a really, really skilled workforce that are already doing great things in the move to electric vehicles. So there's a lot of draw there across the spectrum of types of vehicles as well, not just cars. We've got centres of excellence here for battery chemistries, future battery chemistries, the Advanced Propulsion Centre in particular, and lots of really good academic institutions that are looking at the kind of new tech and innovation in battery chemistry. We won't be able to rival the likes of China on production and labour costs, but we are kind of quite at parity with much of the EU, especially big auto manufacturing countries like Germany. We're basically on parity with the costs there. One really important thing is that from a UK perspective, we have quite good rigorous modern slavery laws and legislation. We can ensure much better scrutiny of critical minerals that are coming into the country, their sourcing, the types of labour that are being used to mine them, basically just much higher regulation of human rights in the supply chain, which is something we don't really hear enough about, I don't think. We also do have an abundance of cheap, clean energy in the form of offshore wind, which, if governed correctly, could be going straight to gigafactories and battery producers to provide cheap energy, because these are very energy intensive industries. So there are a lot of draws to coming to the UK, but the barriers at the moment, unfortunately, are higher. So breaking those down, I think, will really help bring investment back to UK shores.
Really helpful, thank you. And yeah, so Green Alliance have got some work coming out, hopefully towards the end of March, early April, on this and the UK sort of green comparative advantages. But I think in terms of industrial strategy, what you're looking to do is potentially three things in response to IRA. One is maintain your existing area of expertise. That's your renewables, like Anna would say. You're looking to secure future value from potentially the next wave of industries. I think we're particularly interested in sort of eco-design, green finance, smart grids, some of the more leaning into the UK services expertise as well. But then, as Anna and Helena both said, there are critically areas of national security that you need at least some proportion of manufacturing in the UK or in very close allies to allow for breakdowns in international trade or difficulties in securing materials and minerals. Luke, I'd like to come to you if you've got any thoughts on sort of the comparative advantage and particularly from the work on the Centre for Environmental Justice, but also to ask this other question, which I think is particularly relevant given the focus groups you've run, is alongside an industrial strategy to grow our green industries, do we need to be thinking about industrial strategy that is looking to shrink other ones? And how do you potentially manage those two things at the same time?
So I mean, just broadly on the comparative advantage, so I agree with everything that's been said. I think the other interesting thing is there was a paper recently by, I think it was from the LSE, Anna Valero, which showed that actually a lot of the high growth specialisms in which we have comparative advantages are again outside London, which again, is another kind of argument for the place-based industrial strategy argument, and points to the fact that a lot of this kind of investment and industrial strategy approach could help deliver more regionally balanced growth across the country, which I think is a really important part of the story. But fully agree with everything that's been said about the kind of particular sectors that we have potential advantages in, and just, as a mid-sized country, the Inflation Reduction Act spreads its money across 20 different sectors. We obviously don't have the capability to do that. And, this isn't about picking winners, it's about picking strengths. The UK really does need a much more intelligent approach to doing that. And, which is implied in a kind of industrial strategy. I think on your point, I think politically, it's really important that we work out the areas. Industrial strategy can also support industries where there are other things, as you've already highlighted, than just economic advantage, whether it's national security, energy security, supply chain security, and in some areas it may actually be a form of political security, where it feels kind of implausible that certain industries could be allowed to shrink. And I think industrial policy has a role in supporting all of those. I think, on the shrinking point, I think, we have to be honest that some sectors of some areas will need particular strategies to ensure that they can have a just transition and fair transition across to the new industries of the economy. I think it is a happy coincidence that in a lot of those areas, those new industries will be cited in very similar areas, but we do need skills policy in particular to provide the training and support to ensure that workers are able to transition across into the new industries. If that might be, training up a gas fitter to be able to implement a heat pump. And industrial policy should be clearly linked with skills policy in order to enable to do that. Sorry.
Right. No, that's really helpful. Thanks, Luke. And I think you're right. Like, one thing that Theresa May didn't learn with her industrial strategy in 2017, that industrial policy is fundamentally about choices. And actually, some of the things that I go into my essay is, if you are signalling the future of the economy in the areas that you want to grow, what that's intended to do is reallocate investment and skills and labour from one sector to another. So whether you need to be explicit in saying we want to shrink this area, I don't think you do, because you're naturally telling investors and companies, actually, here's where you need to pivot your business model and start looking. So to come on to another question in the chat from Anonymous, and I'll open this up to anyone who wants to come in. So we've talked a lot about actually learning the lessons from the implementation of the Act, how it came about, some of its benefits. But are there any UK sectors in which IRA and the Green Deal, industrial policy in the EU will have a positive impact? I think one of the things I've been thinking about is Treasury have always said, why do we need to do that when we can just wait for another country to do it, reduce the price of the technology, then it's going to be nice and cheap for us to buy. But are there like direct benefits to UK companies or sectors?
I mean, I would probably say that it could have some positive impacts, in the sense that there's now quite a lot of pressure on government to respond to this in some form, whether that's a joined up plan like we'd like to see, or even, some of those measures that have been mentioned before on capital allowances, on strategy for batteries, anything like that. I think there's now a much greater imperative to move quickly on that. And I think in some areas where, before we could say, actually, we're the world leader in renewables, for example, we can afford to take our time. We really can't do that now. The US has put this out there. They've got a huge regulatory orbit. They're pulling other countries in there. So we've already got the EU responding. We could have other countries following suit. So I would say overall, it could be a positive impact, because it just creates that sense of urgency in terms of responding. And, likewise, I think from the perspective of tackling climate change, yes, it's good, because there's just more investment that we need to make in these sectors across the board. And the US is an important trading partner for the UK. So yes, we could access some of those markets, but again, let's make sure that we don't just have the opportunity to import something cheaply, but we actually have some of the jobs and the skills here as well.
Helena, Luke, any points to add on that? Luke?
I think the only thing I'd say is that, yeah, I mean, as I think everyone knows, we've got kind of quite a lot of advantages in kind of professional and financial services, and I think it's possible that we could benefit in that regard. I think the key thing though is that overall there could be, but it's unlikely that they'll necessarily naturally fall into our lap. Like as well as kind of responding to prevent kind of particular industry or investors going to either the EU or the US. There's also an imperative to make the most of the opportunity for the UK of what they're doing. So it's a kind of defensive and offensive strategy. I think we can benefit, but I think it's unlikely that it's necessarily just going to fall into our lap. I think the way in which some might think. I think we do need a kind of an intelligent response in policy to make sure that we can draw the benefits from it.
Helena,
yeah.
You just put yourself on mute.
Absolute rookie error. Yeah, totally agree with everything Luke and Anna have just said. This doesn't answer the question really directly, but I think just taking a quick step back, if we look at where the US was even just a few years ago on climate, not even policy-wise, just rhetoric and narrative and what it means for the rest of the world and where people see this like net zero path going, it's a complete change in tone, obviously. We have been talking about it in a not a negative light, but with kind of caution, I think, because of what it means for the UK. But overall, I think it's incredibly positive. It's really good to see. And exactly as Luke and Anna just said, it's now up for us to decide how we want to continue stimulating investment in the UK in the green agenda. Yeah,
brilliant. Yes, it is. It's really interesting. I think the change in tone in like August, September, everyone was like, look, the US is back on the park when it comes to climate. How fantastic is this climate bill? And then we are however many 9 months down the line and everyone's like, oh God, and actually it means stuff for the UK. And it's got a little bit more negative. So it's definitely good to remind ourselves of that. And that brings us on nicely actually to Andy Cameron Smith's question about where this response sits and how we think about UK decarbonisation in that context. So we've had a reshuffle. We've split out what was BEIS into the Department for Energy, Security and Net Zero. Very proud of myself on that one. And Business and Trade. If I could start with Anna, because I'm sure you're engaging a lot with the new department. Are you broadly supportive of now having a particular department that could hold on to this response, or is it split across departments? Like how should government think about decarbonisation and the Inflation Reduction Act across these two departments that it's got now?
Yeah, I think, of course, I like that energy's got a clearer focus. I like that it's tied to net zero. And, you know, for the first time, we've got a department that is actually looking after net zero. It's got that in the name. So that's really good. I think one of my concerns is that even before we had this reshuffle, the departments weren't speaking to each other as much as they should have done, because some of these measures are not just about what BEIS, now DESNES, are doing, but it's about how do they get the money from the Treasury, and how does it tie in with the levelling up department and their mission. I don't really see how that communication is going to be improved. So I think what I'd like to see is a better coordination function across the departments, not just, you know, reorganizing stuff. And also really conscious that we're less than 2 years away from a general election. So if we have a Labour government, I'm pretty sure they have their own plans in terms of re-establishing departments and reorganizing some stuff. I'm just really concerned that, you know, if we spend a lot of time moving departments and renaming stuff, it just could delay a lot of things quite significantly, because obviously it takes a bit of time for things to get established after one of these reshuffles. So yes, I would say broadly positive. I like that we have energy and net zero, but yeah, let's make sure that we've got that coordination across government and that stuff isn't getting delayed.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts on departments and structures, machinery of government?
Not majorly beyond what Anna said. I mean, I think it's really positive that there's now someone reporting directly into the PM on net zero. I think that's a really positive point. And I heard from someone in the civil service, I can't remember who, and I can't remember the exact amount, but I think every time there's some kind of departmental change, it costs literally millions of pounds, and it takes a long time to get resettled into new briefs, etc. What I will say is, in the Skidmore Mission Zero review, there was a recommendation for creating, and now I'm going to forget the name of it as well, an office for net zero or something similar that basically sits across the civil service, and different departments then feed into, that then goes directly up to the PM, which I think is an incredibly sensible idea. One of the things that Labour has talked about a bit, if they got into power, is how to embed net zero across all different departments and not see it as a silo. So setting that up kind of from the beginning, I think is probably quite a sensible thing to do, given how broad the net zero agenda stretches across basically everything.
Luke, you came off mute.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I don't think it will make a huge amount of difference from cross-government coordination perspective. I think the only way you get that is, yeah, you're having a prime minister and crucially a treasury that takes it incredibly seriously. You know, you've got to, the treasury can't lead it, but it has to be internalised within it, given its power across government. And fully agree. You know, we've called for a net zero delivery body. I think that's massively important, and that is that kind of body that should coordinate and hold government departments to account. It's quite difficult for an individual department to do that, so having a cross-cutting body to do that, I think is the way to go.
Yeah, great, thank you. And there's an awful lot of disagreement, so if you do want to take some chunks out of each other, it makes it like liven up the end of the webinar, and then you can go your separate ways and don't have to see each other afterwards, so don't worry about that. I think so. I guess I'm slightly in the more skeptical camp. I think establishing the credibility and culture of a new department right before a budget means that you're going to Treasury almost like with a cap in hand, and it's quite hard to convince them of the need of your area, particularly if you then don't have the sort of weight of business behind you that Bayes had. That said, having Grant Shapps leading it, I think, is a good advocate for these things. He is obviously a minister with weight, so that does give it that sort of soft profile within government. But you see this story yesterday about Treasury turning down requests for supercomputers from the new Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. And I worry we might end up in a similar scenario with energy. So we have 3 minutes and a lot of questions. We won't cover Brexit, I'm afraid, Jeffrey, or retained EU law bill, Steve, but do check out Cameron Whitten's essay in the essay collection, which go deep into these issues, and particularly a pragmatic relationship with the EU. So I'll do a very quick one from Louise, which is about the renewables windfall tax and that being a major blocker, and what hopes there is that it might get adjusted. But then also I'll add on to that a question from Rebs about the balance between a race to the top on green industrial strategy, boosting green industries, and actually balancing that with the need to reduce consumption, whether that can form part of campaigning, lobbying, or industrial strategy. I will throw those open. Feel free to answer whichever bit you feel most comfortable, but also any closing thoughts before we bring the webinar to a close. I'll go in reverse order this time, so I'll start with Luke.
So on that Reb's question, I think one of the key things that's come out of IRA and the EU's response, I don't know if this directly responds to it, but I think, you know, there was a real danger that you end up with kind of developed nations kind of moving ahead with arguably kind of protectionist measures that favour kind of domestic industries, and that actually the global south isn't able to benefit and is kind of locked out from elements of that. So I think it's really important that actually, as well as responding domestically, that the UK should respond internationally, use its kind of legacy of climate leadership to work with the US, work with the EU and the global south to ensure that actually there is huge, you know, the benefits of this are transferred, whether it's kind of, you know, agreements around sharing clean tech, etc. I think it's really important that it isn't just kind of the industrialized nations that are able to do this and that the global south gets left behind. I think that the only thing I'd say is that concluding comment is about time. We don't have a huge amount of time to respond, that the government really does need to respond quite quickly. I'm not expecting kind of a response commensurate to the challenge next week, but you know, we do need it kind of this year, because otherwise we're going to see industries and our advantage seeping away.
Brilliant, thanks Luke. So on to Anna.
Thanks. I'll take the question on the windfall tax. I mean, the windfall tax is already the next iteration of what was previously the price cap. So we've had that implemented in October, then it was scrapped and it was replaced with the windfall tax. So we've already been on a bit of a journey on how we tackle these profits and how we respond to the energy crisis. To be honest, I don't really see a lot of hope of it being amended. We were talking back towards the end of last year about indexing that benchmark to the level of inflation, which has been now amended, and we've got the indexation, which is really positive. I think we're just concerned about the duration of the tax. It's in place for 5 years. We still have that price cap on the statute book. So I think just from an investor perspective, it doesn't look great. It's, again, as I've said before, even if there's no chance of scrapping this tax, at least what we could do is ensure that we've got similar investment allowances to oil and gas, and that now we use the budget to look at some that capital allowance framework more widely to ensure that some of these taxation mechanisms are offset, and there's something in there for investors as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Anna. And Helena, 30 seconds to close.
Yeah, not loads to add, to be honest. Just a little bit of response to Reb's question. I think one of the key things that this government and any future government needs to keep doing is talking about what the benefits to the public of net zero policies are. Better air pollution, better well-being, it's good for the economy, it helps with the cost of living crisis. We're just really not nailing it on telling the public that net zero is going to help in lots of other aspects of life as well. So that's kind of something we need to keep doing, Inflation Reduction Act response or otherwise.
Fantastic. So thank you all very much. That was incredibly informative, and thank you all for your questions and engagement. There's a lot more, so please do fly those over onto Twitter, and hopefully we'll be able to answer some of them there. So all that leaves for me is to close the event. Thank you all for coming, and a reminder, there are plenty more essays, not just from all of our wonderful speakers today, but we have ones on trade, ones on industrial policy, on heavy industry, and plenty more. Please do check those out. The link is in the chat. This is on our website and our social media. And hopefully there is more to come, both from the government in the budget and this net zero moment that we hear at the end of March. So thank you all again for coming, and we hope to see you at our next webinar.